Dr. Fisher. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon and good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, please remember that this is a listen-only call, which means that I am unable to hear you. If you have any questions as we move along in our call, please reference the box that you should have on the right side of your screen. It would have popped up when you logged in. That box will allow you to send questions over to me instantly, and if I am able to incorporate those into my talk at that moment, I will. However, please know that I will address all questions at the end of today's call. If perhaps there is something that you would like to speak to me further about, I will be available immediately following today's webinar, so feel free to call my office at 586-323-3620. Again, that number is 586-323-3620. So today we're going to be talking about the impact and consequences of brain injury on the developing child and projecting its effects over time. What are the objectives today? The use of neuropsychological evaluation to determine the following to the best of neuropsychological certainty. Again, we're going to be talking about quality of life issues, the potential of the injured child as a future member of the workforce, the ability of the child to function in traditional school settings, social and emotional relationships, and peer group involvement. The remainder of our objectives will be the risk of criminal activity or substance abuse, risk of dementia, less than graceful aging, future ability to maintain their own day-to-day care and finances, and defining the needs when we think that a child would be in a position where they would probably need a group home or other long-term facility care. So the idea will be to kind of separate out the variables. So let's take the first one, quality of life issues. So based upon neuropsychological evaluations, we can make a prediction as to what that child's quality of life would be like. So what would be some of the variables involved? Well, first of all, you want to take a look at physical. So if they've had any stroke-like effects, we always know that those carry more of an impact over time. So if the injury has to do with cellular, if there is a procedure that happened and they went into a coma in the middle of that procedure, or they had anything that happened on a cellular level with potassium, calcium factors, any kind of a stroke-like effect, TIA process, you can pretty well predict that that's going to carry a more severe outcome. And obviously that's going to affect quality of life and their ability to hold a job and all of the things that we just discussed. So you want to separate that out from someone who had an injury, and let's say, so that's one issue. So one issue is with any stroke-like effect, any TIA-like effect. Another issue is if the injury took place either right before the birth or right after the birth process. Again, that carries a bigger weight. So if you have a medical malpractice and you have an injury that occurred early, anytime you have an injury that occurs early, the tendency in my experience has been that it's going to affect just about all areas of the brain, but it's really, really going to affect the frontal processes, and it's going to affect them big time from the ground up. So if you think about the fact that you're only born with 10% of your brain, and 80% of your brain is formed within the first year of life, you know that if you have an incident that occurs, whether it's a traumatic brain injury or it's a medical malpractice or some kind of event that occurs that affects the brain to a serious degree, that you can pretty well anticipate that there are going to be major, major issues with that child. And then if you look at that child 3 years from that date and they're not developing language, that's another marker. So again, your markers are going to be stroke-like effects. Your markers are going to be if it occurred early in the first year of life. Your marker is going to be at the age of 3 years if they haven't acquired language and they're not intelligible. Those are very, very big markers that are going to help you predict and anticipate that this is a child that probably is not going to lead a normal life. This is a child that probably is going to need a group home or someone facilitating their care and guardianship, whether it be financial and or medical. This is a child that's just going to need somebody taking care of them 24 hours, supervision and care through their lifetime. These are some of the things that you can pretty well predict and anticipate. So given that, then move on down the spectrum. So let's take the child who is a little bit older and they have that type of injury. Well, then it's going to carry less severity. But again, then add in your factors of coma. So for example, there was a young man that I had a case, and this must have been about, oh gosh, about 10 years ago, and he happened to be in Canada. And this particular young man had an injury, and he was 5 years old, but he was in a coma for about 6 weeks. Now, when the child's in a coma for about 6 weeks, what do we know? Well, we know that they're going to be affected on a cellular level in a very big way. And we know that all the systems of the brain are going to be affected in a top-down approach, from the higher cortical processes all the way through the brainstem, because that's why they're in a coma. So again, you can pretty well predict and anticipate that this child's going to have major issues. And with this particular child, he didn't get the care that he needed, and so his language skills never developed past the age of 5 years, where he was at the time of injury. And actually, we were able to prove through some things that he had done pre-injury with cards and some writing samples that he had actually declined. So when we tested him at the age of 13, we were able to prove that he had actually declined from below the age of 5 years, where he was at the time of injury. So that being said, he had a lot of major issues because he hadn't received any sort of care. He actually had one leg that was shorter than the other to a noticeable degree. His MRI showed marked changes. And once you see marked changes on the MRI, that's a major issue, because you've got to have a lot of significant damage on a cellular basis to show up on an MRI. And again, things have changed a little bit with the new Tesla machine that they're using, but generally speaking, for MRIs around the country, unless you're using really state-of-the-art MRI, you're going to have that principle operating. So at any rate, he had major issues, showed up on a PET scan with major issues, and he basically could not take care of himself. So again, a coma is another factor to consider. So any time that you're impacting the brain in a big way, whatever you're impacting the brain with a coma, you're automatically hitting the brainstem. Well, if you hit the brainstem, which is the lower brain function, you're automatically going to hit higher brain function. So that's going to be compromising the whole brain. So these are all markers to think about when you're looking at a pediatric injury, whether it be the age or the degree of injury, and the symptoms and signs that you're seeing, intelligibility, development. These are all things that are going to be markers to determine the child's quality of life. So again, a child's potential as a future member of the workforce. The big question is, will the child ever be able to work? What kind of work? Now, when you're considering this, you have to separate out your factors. So let's say the child has a physical problem because we hit the brainstem area, or they've got a cerebral palsy, which is a big word that just simply means floppy motor, which is generally related to some sort of a problem that happened around the birth process. So you're going to want to, or if there's a TIA and there's a stroke-like effects, and they may have, one side of their body, hemiplegia, where they have problems, or they may have a hemianopsia, where they have visual field problems, etc. So those are all going to affect them in terms of physically affecting their work. If you were watching this webinar, listening to the webinar from last week, you would know that emotional is going to have a big effect, because if you have somebody who has a number of emotional issues, they're not going to be able to work. Now, any time that you impact the frontal area of the brain and that child's young, you have a good likelihood that they're going to develop psychosis by the time they hit adolescence and young adulthood. That being said, that would determine their emotional ability to interact in a work setting. So if you have someone who is paranoid schizophrenic, and schizophrenia is just a big word, which means a loss of reality or psychosis. Paranoid schizophrenic is like the highest functioning of the schizophrenic line. But it means that that person is very suspicious. It means that they suspect everybody of everything. They're paranoid. So there are two things that are going to happen. One, they're not going to let anybody know who they are. They're going to be locked up very tight. And two, they're going to be very critical, questioning, judgmental of everyone around them. It's going to make for a very uncomfortable work atmosphere, meaning the likelihood of that person surviving at a work atmosphere on an emotional aspect is not very high. So that being said, anytime that you injure the brain when the individual is young in childhood, you've got a great likelihood you're going to hit those frontal processes. You've got a great likelihood you're going to hit their ability to define what's reality and what's not, and you've got a great likelihood that you're going to be looking at some neuropsychotic processes by the time they enter adolescence and young adulthood. And then you have the third factor, which is cognitive. So again, it just depends on how they've been impacted cognitively that's going to determine their potential to be able to work. Now, what's the big marker for that? Do they have intelligibility? So if you have a child who by 3 years of age doesn't have intelligibility, you've got an issue on your hands. It's already a marker that we know very well for autism. Of course, the question is always what really is autism. But the point being is that intelligibility is a very big marker. If a child is not intelligible and they have not acquired language, then you know a number of different things. One, they're not paying attention or looking at the face enough to acquire the ability to move their mouth to acquire language. So you know you have an attention problem. Two, you know you have a memory problem because they're not able to retain that information in memory and to repeat back. The ability to repeat back what the adult has said is a major determinant in acquiring intelligibility, because if you're not repeating it back, that's how children learn how to speak. So these are all factors that if you are interviewing parents and they bring in your child and that child doesn't have intelligibility and you're seeing those signs, you can pretty well predict and anticipate you're going to have a major issue on your hands. So those are the cognitive factors. So as we move on, ability to function in a traditional school setting. And again, that's going to depend upon the degree of injury. Now, a very good example is a child that just arrived at our clinic yesterday from another part of the state. And this little girl had an injury. She's not little now, she's now going on 13. But she had an injury at the age of 3, and we're on our 3rd year of serial testing. Meaning what we're doing is retesting her each year to see where she is. We're not retesting all the measures, but we have a baseline and we're retesting a good portion of the measures depending on what she's struggling with. And there's an up and down that's occurring. What's happening is there are some areas that she actually did better in 2006 than she's doing in 2008. There are some areas that she has noticeably improved in 2008. We've also been doing some brain training work with her as well. The theme as to what determines the improvement or what determines the decline is the impact of the frontal processes. So what's happening with this girl is the major issue that's emerging with her is the frontal area of the brain is now breaking through, and it's breaking through loud and clear. So what does that look like for her? Well, she's going on 13, so she has deepened emotions. So you ask her, well, how's school? And she tells you about one child that's bothering her. And so you say to her, well, okay, let's get rid of this one child as a factor. What do you think about school? And she tells you about a teacher that's bothering her. So you say, all right, well, let's take away the teacher, let's take away the factor, and how do you feel about school? Well, now she tells you about this one particular subject that's bothering her. So it's one particular issue, but that one issue colors everything, and then she proceeds to have these very deep tears that you can't get her out of. So what happens when the frontal processes are involved is that you have a deepened emotionality you can't move them out of. They get into that emotionality for one particular issue that's not always terribly rational, certainly not a big picture framework, and then they get stuck on it. These are all frontal lobe traits. So what else is going on with her is that she's now having low self-esteem because she's realizing the difference between herself and her peers. So she's not fitting into the school setting because she's aware that she's different. She has some ptosis of her eye, one of her eyes droops. She's got some gait problems that are left over from the injury, and she has a tremor. And she was not aware of this 3 years ago at all, and now she is very, very aware of this. And only she's over-aware because the frontal processes are in gear. So now in her mind, everyone looks at her and sees her as deformed. Now, during this whole process, she's had eye surgeries, and her eyes actually look fabulous, and certainly much better than they did. But that's not what's going on in her mind. So in her mind, she doesn't fit in. In her mind, she has low self-esteem. In her mind, she wants to be by herself. In her mind, no one likes her. In her mind, she can't learn. In her mind, school is too hard. And in her mind, everything's a mess, and she just wants to stay under the covers and not get up in the morning. That's not reality, but that's where she's at. So it's a very good example of how pediatric brain injury affects their ability to function in the traditional school setting. And most of the time, these kids do not make it in the school setting. Most of the time, because of the behavior, these kids are labeled bipolar. or they're labeled conduct disorder, or the favorite is ADHD, and they're placed in special education and gotten out of the traditional mainstream so they don't bother anybody, and then they really don't get an education. So they have generally, when there's a pediatric brain injury, they're going to have a problem functioning in a traditional school setting. And one of the things that I have seen in my experience of being involved with a TBI for over 24 years is that basically they're not going to function in a traditional school setting. It's not going to come down. And they really do need private school settings, whether it be a smaller classroom that's a lot smaller than the private school settings. I mean, there's a whole variance of private school settings. But generally speaking, any child who has had a pediatric brain injury is simply not going to make it in the traditional school setting, because 9 times out of 10 they're going to have a frontal lobe problem, and the schools don't know how to teach them, which is also why we're working on writing curriculum for the schools. So that being said, long story short, I would just go with the realization that there's a very slim likelihood they're going to function in a regular setting, and be aware that that's got to be figured in your costs. Social, emotional relationships, peer group involvement, again, that's going to change with age. So let's go back to the case of this girl that just came in recently for an evaluation. She did not realize her differences 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, when she was tested at the age of 9, she was not aware that she looked very different. She was not aware of her gait being different. She really didn't have a concern about that, because developmentally at that time, she's in the developmental stage of latency, if you go with Freudian theory or some of the other stage theories of developmental theory. So basically that's not on the agenda as to what she needs to be doing in her life. What they're doing at the age of 9, 10 years is basically they're in a learning curve that's going on at that age. There isn't a lot of social involvement at that age. It's really more of a learning, and there isn't a lot going on in terms of conflictual processes, again, based on developmental stage theory. So she really wasn't aware of that. But now as she moves into adolescence, those things are huge. So again, it really depends upon the age of the child as to what's going to happen in terms of their involvement socially, emotionally, and how different they're going to appear. The other piece is that when you have a child that has frontal lobe problems, and with pediatric brain injury, that's pretty well much of the time, they don't always have an internal conscience. They don't always have a stop system. It's a go system. They feel like if they do it. They think if they say it. And so what happens is, and this is the case of one young man that I saw from the age of 6 until the age of 11, and at 6 he was adorable. I mean, he was definitely a little bit odd, but by 11, all of a sudden it dawned on all of us that he didn't have a conscience. So he'd be standing in line waiting to use a slide, and he would just knock the girl aside and take her place in line and slide down the slide. And he thought nothing of it, and he was getting in these continual fights. And when we asked him, what was the problem? He said, well, she was in my way. And of course, everybody was in his way. So it dawned on the parents and myself that basically he really did not have a conscience at this age. So we developed a very strong, intense behavioral program using a number of different interventions to develop a conscience. And parents need to know that you're making up for the lack of an internal conscience. So you've got to create a very strong external conscience that basically says, this is how we do it, period. But it's got to be very clear. And it's not something that you can sit down and explain to this child, because they're not always going to even be able to understand your explanation. So there comes a point where you've got to develop a behavioral plan that's based on behavior and consequences, but that's very clear, this is what we're tolerating, this is what we're not, because they don't always get it otherwise. If that does not happen, these children easily grow up without a conscience, and therefore they're very much at risk for criminal activities. And anyone who's done any work in the criminal field knows that our jails and prisons are made up with a good portion of the population that has some sort of injury to the brain. And as a result, they don't have a conscience. If you think about the true pathological killer, there is no conscience. There is no empathy. Well, if you involve the right frontal processes, many of you have heard me speak before, there is no empathy, there is no conscience. So unless you build in a conscience on a continual basis, when that child is young, when they get to be, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, that's not going to be there. So, and that's very important to remember. The other thing that tends to happen is that there's a lot of substance abuse that takes place. So if you have a child who has a pediatric brain injury and they're having seizures that are not diagnosed, they have events that they can't explain. So as a result of the anxiety or the discomfort, they look to be released and basically live on a different world. And that would be their involvement in substance abuse, and then the addiction takes over from there. Another way to look at it is if there's a frontal processes problem, what do we know about them? They're type A personalities. They sleep hard, they live hard, they work hard, they drink hard, they smoke hard, they eat hard. You know, it's all of the isms. If anyone's familiar with the alcohol isms, that's always a frontal lobe issue. So that being said, basically, if there's a frontal lobe problem, that they're definitely going to be a risk for substance abuse just because that's that type of personality. There's a lot of overdiagnosis of bipolar disorder. There's a whole school of thought that has documented the presence of seizures that are manifested as bipolar. And there's been a number of cases that we've had where children have been misdiagnosed as bipolar when they're really having seizures. So that's a very big problem. Then what happens is they get medication for bipolar, which often sets off something else going on. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? How much of it is that the behavior of the brain injured child is being misread and then misdiagnosed and then incorrectly medicated, and what the effects of medication? How much of it is the frontal lobe manifesting itself? How much of it is seizure activity that's going on? These are all issues, and it's a wake-up call that when you send children who have had some sort of an injury to the brain to professionals, they really need to be aware of the impact of injury to the brain and what that looks like. And if they're not, there's a lot of mistakes. I'll never forget that I was at one of these dinners that are basically paid for by the drug companies, and there was a psychiatrist talking, and she was talking about bipolar. And someone asked the question, did you ever consider that there was a head injury? And the response from the psychiatrist was, I never even thought to ask about head injury. And this is actually relatively common practice. So there really is a problem in terms of misdiagnosis and then a problem in terms of medication. And as a result, you have a child who basically has all these symptoms, and again, it could be due to a number of different things. So it's important to keep that in mind in terms of their care and looking at what's going on with their care. Risk of dementia and less than graceful aging. Generally speaking, if you have pediatric brain injury, you always have a problem with graceful aging. And the new research has clearly shown that every child who has a significant pediatric brain injury is going to be at risk for Alzheimer's dementia. And that is coming out in the research in a very, very clear manner. So how do you handle that? Well, there are different physicians and neurologists that believe in bringing in the medication that we use for Alzheimer's, which is the anticholinergic medication, very quickly in your life. The problem is that it's also well known in the field, and I have certainly seen this personally over the years, that once they're on the medication, they can't get off. Because when they get off the medication, there's a serious decline. Now, that hasn't been seen or tracked with children, but certainly with the aged population. So it becomes an issue to be aware that this is there, and then to work with the professional to determine the time when it's important to come in with that type of medication so that they don't, so they're not at risk for Alzheimer's and early dementia. Protecting the brain injured children in civil cases. There was a case that really brings this to point. There was a man who was in St. Louis, and he was accused of sexual misconduct with a child. And the Miranda rights were read, and the case was built around the fact that he did not understand the Miranda rights. It was very interesting. So we did an evaluation and took apart all of the pieces of the Miranda rights and then used neuropsychological testing to assess the brain function they would need to have to understand those portions of the Miranda rights. There was a trial that ensued, and during the course of the trial and the attorney questioning this man, it became very apparent that he would not have understood Miranda rights. So again, that's a very good case in point. It's important to understand that children who have a brain injury tend to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They don't see that there's a fight that's starting to break out in the bar and they're still seated there when the fight takes place. They don't anticipate they're hooking up with the wrong person. It's going to lead them down a path that's not going to be a very good situation for them. They can't anticipate consequences of their own behavior. They get frustrated and angry and mad, and then create all of these situations that they seem unable to control at the time. Another case in point is we had this man who had a motorcycle accident when he was in his 20s. 2 years later, he was at a party drinking because after this motorcycle accident, there was a heightened increase in substance abuse. He was at a party drinking, and then he got into a fight with someone who broke a bottle over his head. So now he has another brain injury. And as a result of his continual emotional outbursts, he landed in prison. And then he got out of prison and landed in more fights and landed on probation and then back in prison. So again, the whole thing goes on, and basically what it comes down to is that when there's a brain injury and you're dealing with the frontal area of the brain, they don't understand what's going on in the situation. They don't comprehend what's being said, and they end up in the wrong place at the wrong time and or unable to control their own behavior. With this girl who recently came in for testing, any of the questions that involved comprehension, any of the questions that involved the subtleties where you had to make an inference, she didn't get. She thinks very concretely, and she's going on 13 years old. So these are all things to consider, and in terms of protecting them, again, you would want to give them a whole scenario of, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, as much as possible, not to restrict their life, but basically to try and prevent them being in the wrong place at the wrong time as much as you possibly can. Future ability to maintain their own day-to-day care and finances. And again, all of these issues are going to come up depending upon the variables that I started this webinar with, which are, whether there are cellular effects involving the brain, coma, TIA, stroke-like effects, etc., the age at the time of the injury, the degree of physical impact. These are all going to be issues that would answer that question about the ability to maintain their own finances. Generally speaking, your variables are if you have a pediatric injury that's young, if you have neuropsych testing that identifies huge frontal lobe involvement, or a PET scan or an MRI, know that in all likelihood they're not going to be able to maintain their own day-to-day care and finances. The same is true of defining the needs for a group home and other long-term care facilities. That basically, if you have a child where there's a lot of emotional outbursts that they can't get them under control, intractable seizures, especially if their frontal lobe, involve a lot of emotional outbursts and kicking and biting and hitting and things that happen in the middle of the night, etc. That's going to determine their inability to remain in the home because they would be a threat to either themselves or other members of the family. If there's a pervasive injury physically, they're not going to be able to maintain and be cared for in the home. And again, of course, the aging process is a consideration. So it's the same group of variables, but again, I can't stress enough the impact of the very early injury, the marker of language acquisition, and of course the frontal processes being affected as the seat of civilization. So projecting future care costs really needs to be based upon the type of injury and the age of injury, as you're hearing me say. Those are your variables. Again, the impact of the frontal processes, physical impact, the type of injury, and the risk of future injury. Those are very, very big issues when there's been a major injury. We all know that kids who have had a major injury tend to be what? Not terribly coordinated, and they lose their balance, so they're at risk for more injuries and more falls. So it's not surprising if you have a child who has a considerable injury that they've had some more injuries by the time you take that case. So again, one thing begets another, so it's just important to be aware that when you have those early variables, that is going to predict that they're going to need a lot of future care. Long-term symptoms and consequences, and again, I'm going to tell you the same thing. If there's seizures, that's going to add another variable. If there's cellular damage, stroke-like effect. As I talked before, be aware that with electrical injury, the problem gets worse over time, doesn't get better. And with pediatric injury, I mean, the major thing I'm really stressing to all of you today is the fact that when you hit that young brain early, you have a widespread effect, especially in the first year of life. You have a widespread effect. So basically that means that they're at risk for cells to have abnormal connectivity, and they're at risk for abnormal cells to lead to more cell death, to lead to more abnormal connectivity, to lead to more cell death, to lead to changes in chemical and electrical balances in the brain, which then sets off protective factors in the brain, and there's a whole chain of events that affects all kinds of cellular changes that alter the brain, and that is going to be a very big predictor that you're going to have a child with serious consequences and the need for long-term care and planning. So what we offer at United Psychological Services is a comprehensive treatment report. It's a team effort where we really test the child and document and provide documentation through evaluation and our experience of what the future, to as much as we can predict with the best degree of neuropsychological certainty, will bring for that child, and identify all of these variables in the report in a very logical, systematic, scientific process / format to give you what you need to make predictions from there. We have a team of specialists who've been involved with brain injury for 20 years or more. We also manage the case in terms of interfacing with the various specialist primary care physicians, particularly the school and or the work setting and the attorney. I mean, there's much that we can do to help. A serious injury doesn't mean that we can't still help. It carries a poor prognosis, but it doesn't mean that we can't still provide help for that child and some type of hope for the future, even though we know very clearly that they're facing very serious lifelong consequences of that injury. So we develop a specific cognitive therapy program that can be taken anywhere in the country, and brain training programs with the child can be implemented for the child in their home or school or wherever. We address the emotional impact of the ill child upon the family unit, because it's not only the child that's affected, it's the whole family that's affected. It's the siblings that are affected in so many different ways, as well as the parents. Our evaluations, we provide a comprehensive psychological assessment, cognitive assessment, the gold standard for neuropsychological evaluations that we support, and of course we track all the different areas of the brain with testing. We have a treatment team staff that you see listed in front of you, as well as consulting staff that we work with to provide cutting-edge, state-of-the-art, one-stop shopping at United Psychological Services. So again, we also outreach across the country with the top experts, educational specialists, pediatric adult neurologists, vocational economists, expert planner, etc. You can see that on your screen. People who have been working with CDI for 20 years and are well recognized in the field. So at United Psychological Services, we offer unequaled, precise, sensible, comprehensive testing, precise, accurate diagnosis, and sensible, successful treatment. A multidisciplinary clinic committed to providing testing, diagnosis, and support to individuals dealing with a number of psychological and neuropsychological disorders, emotional as well as brain-based, in one location. So that's it for today. I hope this was illuminating for you and helpful information. Again, I will be available for any questions that you might have at the number of 586-323-3620. I thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.